Hey there everyone, today I'd like to discuss Book 1 of Plato's Republic, and in particular, I want to look at the argumentation between Socrates and Thrasymachus over justice. Now, all of the Republic is about justice. It's about what is justice and what does this mean for the type of societies that we make. How do we make a society that is oriented around virtue or justice or goodness or whatever it may be? And I think Thrasymachus has some very compelling points, despite the fact that Socrates, or Plato, would like us to think that he has been defeated by the end of Book 1. It seems that Thrasymachus gives up and he's like, okay, yeah, you're right, Socrates. But I would actually like to show how Thrasymachus' argumentation is more compelling than Socrates/Plato gives it credence for, and how Thrasymachus' argumentation actually mirrors a lot of 19th and 20th century philosophy, particularly Nietzsche and the postmodernists. Now, Thrasymachus' position can be put fairly plainly here on 338c. Now listen, he said, I say that the just is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. So right, as we're trying to nail down what justice is, and this is an ontological question of what actually is justice, right? Not what it appears to be, at least for Plato. He's trying to get past the mere appearances of justice or the changing vicissitudes of society. He's trying to figure out what is going to be this firm foundation upon which we can build a society that is going to be able to last forever. Right? Because, of course, this is mirroring the eternal order of the gods and the forms. Because for everything ontological, Plato says that it is mirroring and it is getting its essence from the forms. So anytime we're talking about justice or truth or virtue or the good, all of this is, regardless of the particulars, whether or not we're talking about this or that good deed or this or that just person, they are getting what it means to be just as such from the form just, which is basically the unpredicated in and of itself from which we are able to deduce particulars, and by which particulars are actually able to work in the world. And Thrasymachus is saying here that what justice is ontologically is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger, which is notably relativistic, right? Because what is to the advantage of the stronger will change in its particulars from moment to moment. Sometimes, some law may be to the advantage of the one who is stronger, or as we would say today, the one who has power. And then maybe the next year, something happened in their kingdom and all of a sudden this law is now not to their advantage. So there's a lot of changes occurring here. And I think Plato, or Socrates again, these are kind of interchangeable in certain senses. It's hard to actually delineate what is the difference between each of them. Plato/Socrates is worried about this because he thinks that this is not a super indubitable foundation. It's going to shift a lot and it's relativistic. But I think what Thrasymachus is pointing out here is that there is no foundation to justice. There is no justice in and of itself. There is only a number of things which are perceived as just, or which are just for such and such person. In the same way that when we talk about something being good, we can't actually talk about the unpredicated good as such. Because when we're talking about something being good, we necessarily have to talk about a subject which something is good for, right? This food is good for you or bad for you in the sense of, relating to health, but even in the purely moral sense, sometimes, returning a weapon, as is said at the very beginning of Book 1, sometimes that is good. Sometimes that's bad. If the person is deranged, then maybe it's not the best thing to give back the weapon because you risk your safety, right? But if they're in good conscience and you have an agreement with them that you're going to borrow this weapon, then you need to give it back. So we can't actually talk about these unpredicated ideas of goodness or justice. And I think Thrasymachus recognizes that and says that, look, we can get all high in the sky about what really is justice, but what we actually see as justice is whatever that which is stronger claims it is. And Socrates gets a little uneasy about this, but Thrasymachus says, okay, in each city, isn't the ruling group master? And Socrates says, well, certainly. And Thrasymachus says, and each ruling group sets down laws for its own advantage. A democracy sets down democratic laws, a tyranny, tyrannic laws, and the others do the same. And they declare that what they have set down, their own advantage, is just for the ruled, and the man who departs from it they punish as a breaker of the law and a doer of unjust deeds. This, best of men, is what I mean. In every city, the same thing is just, the advantage of the established ruling body. It surely is master. So the man who reasons rightly concludes that everywhere justice is the same thing, the advantage of the stronger. And we can see that when he's saying that justice is the same thing everywhere, he's meaning that it is deduced from the same principle, namely, whatever is to the advantage of the stronger. Not that what that advantage is will be common to all people or all nations or all times, right? This is going to depend. But this advantage is the basis on which laws and rules get established and get sent down by ruling groups in order to maintain their authority, their power, their strength, their position of privilege, right? And we see this in modern society. This to me doesn't seem that controversial at all. When a political party is in power, it is going to, elect people who are going to help perpetuate their rule and potentially ensure that they're reelected, right? Because these sorts of practices, you could think of like gerrymandering, for example, stealthily or perhaps not so stealthily drawing voting districts in order to disadvantage certain groups of people in order to maintain some group's hegemony. These sort of unjust practices, they do in fact work. They do in fact allow for the further perpetuation of laws and for a ruling establishment. So I think Thrasymachus is actually being fairly cogent here when he delivers us this idea. Now remember when I said that Socrates gets a little uneasy about this because it's a bit of an unstable foundation, it's going to change? Well, Socrates says, but whatever the ruler set down must be done by those who are ruled, and this is just? And Thrasymachus says, of course. And Socrates builds an argument from here where he says, okay, if it's just to do whatever the ruling group sets down in rules or laws, what happens when they think they're setting down a law which is to their advantage, but actually it's to their disadvantage? Would this still be just? Because we've just said that justice is always acting to the advantage of the powerful. So either we have a situation where it is just to do something which is actually to their detriment, or it is sometimes just to ignore laws which have been set down by the ruling power. And now we have kind of a lopsided way of thinking about societies. And Socrates really thinks he got him here. I've got you in a bind. And Cleitophon further shows the blunder when he says, he, that being Thrasymachus, said that the advantage of the stronger is what the stronger believes to be his advantage. But this is not true. This is not what Thrasymachus is saying. Thrasymachus has not been saying that justice is what the stronger believes to be his advantage. No, it is what is to his advantage. Whether or not they, sometimes blunder and make a law which actually happens to be beneficent and therefore to their disadvantage and to the rule's advantage. No, it's just the case that sometimes, the powerful aren't perfect. This seems to me to just evade Thrasymachus's point and, say that, oh, because they're not always perfect, therefore we're negating this ontological relationship between power and justice or morality. No, I think it very much still stands. Now, because, as I said, Socrates is deducing all of his notions of ontology from the forms, from this ideal realm of unpredicated things in and of themselves, we get into some kind of sleazy rhetoric or philosophy where he basically is just assuming his terms from the outset. And I guess within Socrates' philosophical framework, sure, it's consistent or it's a cogent argument. But is it true? That's what we're trying to figure out. We're trying to figure out what correlates with reality. And I think one of the things that, for example, the American pragmatists were so aware of is that there are a lot of invented problems, such as the ones we see in Cartesianism and also the ones we see in Platonic philosophy, created because we would like things to be a certain way. We would like reality to be a certain way. But we don't actually tailor our problems or our questions to that reality. We invent things instead of looking at this is how justice or injustice actually plays itself out. So we get really strange arguments, such as the one where Socrates says, therefore, Thrasymachus, there isn't ever anyone who holds any position of rule, insofar as he is a ruler, who considers or commands his own advantage rather than that of what is ruled, and of which he himself is the craftsman. And it is looking to this and what is advantageous and fitting for it, that he says everything he says and does everything he does. So Socrates has built this a priori image of, well, the real ruler, the one who holds a position of rule insofar as he is a ruler, who is a ruler ontologically, that, he's the one who cares genuinely about the advantage of those whom he rules. This would be very nice if this were actually a useful strategy or something we see in reality. What we actually see is that when people rule, they don't primarily or solely care about the advantage of those whom they rule over. They care about perpetuating their own strength and advantage. And Socrates is getting this argumentation from a bit he said before, in which he says, okay, look, when we're talking about medicine, for example, medicine doesn't consider the advantage of medicine, but the body. It doesn't concern its own self-perpetuation. It concerns the perpetuation of the object which it is trying to talk about and which it is trying to order. But I don't think that justice is quite the same way, right? Because we can say that justice really is caring for others, but where are we getting that? How do we know? Right? A lot of these discussions are often dovetailing not only into ontological questions of what is justice, but when Socrates says, for example, that the real ruler is the one who never commands his own advantage, but always commands the advantage of those whom he rules, how does he know that? Where is he saying that from? It seems to me that we have a very pernicious idea of who ought to rule, where we create this beneficent ruler stereotype that allows us to create, frankly, tyrannical systems that allow people to have relatively unfettered power on the grounds that, well, we elected them and our government represents us and they're a good person and they care about my advantage, therefore they have the right to rule. No. We're giving the ruler way too much credence there. And Thrasymachus bites back here. He asks Socrates, does he have a wet nurse? And Socrates is like, why are you asking me this instead of just answering my question? And Thrasymachus says, because you know she neglects your sniveling nose and doesn't give it the wiping you need, since it's her fault you do not even recognize sheep or shepherd. And Socrates asks, because of what in particular? And Thrasymachus says, because you suppose shepherds and cowherds consider the good of the sheep or the cows, and fatten them and take care of them, looking to something other than their master's good and their own. And so you also believe that the rulers in the cities, those who truly rule, think about the ruled differently from the way a man would regard sheep, and that night and day they consider anything else than how they will benefit themselves. And you are so far off about the just and justice, and the unjust and injustice, that you are unaware that justice and the just are really someone else's good, the advantage of the man who is stronger and rules, and a personal harm to the man who obeys and serves. And again, this is where we see that connection to even people like Hegel in his master and slave dialectic. We're seeing the same thing with sheep and shepherd. We also see this in Nietzsche's master and slave morality, right? And this image of mastery and slavery, we see this in Marx talking about wage slavery, for example. We see this in contemporary society where typically conservative people will, call someone a sheep or you're a sheeple, right? It's seen as a derogatory term because you just submit to the ruling authority. And Thrasymachus is saying that in the same way, the shepherd cares about not the sheep's well-being in and of itself because he's just a good shepherd. No, that's not what a shepherd is. What a shepherd is someone who tends to the sheep because it is a business practice, because it is a contractual obligation they have with someone who has employed them, and also they therefore care about the well-being and the satisfaction of that employer because then they get a wage and therefore it reflects on their own well-being. So we can see here a sort of psychological hedonism that Thrasymachus is espousing, that we do everything ultimately because it favors our own well-being. And indeed, when a ruler is ruling the ruled, he does so because he wants to perpetuate his own power because this helps his well-being. And as long as he can give the facade of working for others' well-being, well, then he keeps his post. And that's something that Socrates is later going to try to bite back on Thrasymachus for. Well, if everyone is always acting unjust, then we can actually create a harmonic society where we can get along. As long as you can give the image of acting justly, of quote-unquote representing those who voted for you, for example, in the contemporary case, well, then you can keep ruling. And Thrasymachus mentions how injustice is actually pretty profitable. He says that, look, if we look at reality, we see that those who are unjust tend to profit the most, and those who are just tend to profit the least, or in fact lose. For example, when it comes to paying taxes, the just person is going to put in extra money to their taxes to make sure that they're paying their dues. And the unjust person might even engage in some sleazy practices where they try to avoid paying their taxes. And in the end, as long as they get away with it, they will actually, even though they did something unjust, they will be more rewarded materially. And this is very true, that justice does not tend to win. Injustice and cruelty tends to win. This is one of the favorite messages that is in the Marquis de Sade's Justine. That in fact we like to think that this ideal perfection of virtue and whatnot is going to win out, but no, virtue does not win out. Thrasymachus states here at 344a, I am speaking of the man I just now spoke of, the one who was able to get the better in a big way. Consider him if you want to judge how much more to his private advantage the unjust is than the just. You will learn more easily of all if you turn to the most perfect injustice, which makes the one who does injustice most happy, and those who suffer it and who would not be willing to do injustice most wretched. And that is tyranny, which by stealth and force takes away what belongs to others, both what is sacred and profane, private and public, not bit by bit, but all at once. When someone does some part of this injustice and doesn't get away with it, he is punished and endures the greatest reproaches. Temple robbers, kidnappers, housebreakers, defrauders, and thieves are what they call those partially unjust men who do such evil deeds. But when someone, in addition to the money of the citizens, kidnaps and enslaves them too, well, instead of these unshameful names, he gets called happy and blessed, not only by the citizens, but also by whomever else hears that he has done injustice entire. For it is not because they fear doing unjust deeds, but because they fear suffering them, that those who blame injustice do so. So, Socrates, injustice, when it comes into being on a sufficient scale, is mightier, freer, and more masterful than justice. And as I have said from the beginning, the just is the advantage of the stronger, and the unjust is what is profitable and advantageous for oneself. And we're seeing that psychological hedonism in much more clarity here, what is profitable and advantageous for oneself. So this is, of course, a very narcissistic way of looking at justice and morality, but I would argue it reflects reality pretty well. And that's what we're concerned with, right? What is true? What genuinely reflects states of affairs, rather than giving us these arbitrary and made-up hopes that actually will work to our disadvantage by setting up institutions, for example, which prey on that hope in order to take advantage of us. So in fact, when we look at the tyrant, he's going to take advantage of other people. And if someone in a pretty lowly position fails to do so and gets caught, well, right, they get reprimanded. They get seen as evil. But if, in addition to taking the citizens' money, this is a reference, of course, to taxes, but also enslaves them, and you could think of this as a rigid social structure, well, they're seen as legitimate. They're seen as having rightful authority. And this is a key topic of postmodern philosophy, that notions of knowledge and truth are the functions of authorities who are deemed legitimate and who can therefore bestow some notion of truth or what one ought to do. So normative claims here, again, just like justice is a normative claim. Justice is what one ought to do. It is the function of power. It's the function of one of these ruling groups who is going to say what is best for us to do. This reminds me of a passage from the Marquis de Sade's Justine, where it is said, "Thus the truly wise person is the one who, at the risk of resuming the state of war that reigned before the pact," this is in reference to the social contract theory, "launches himself with all his might against this pact, violating it as much as he can, in a certain knowledge that whatever profit he makes from these violations will always be greater than what he might lose if he is the weakest. For he was in no better position when he respected the pact. He may become the strongest in violating it, and if the law relegates him to the social class that he wished to leave behind, his last resource is to lose his life, which is an infinitely lesser misfortune than that of living in opprobrium and misery. These, then, are the two options facing us: crime, which makes us happy, or the scaffold, which stops us from being unhappy." And of course, that's put in a very flowery way, but it's a very similar thing, where what the unjust person is going to try to do is they're going to give this semblance that in fact they are acting, in this benevolent way, that they are acting for the good of society, where in actuality they are violating the well-being of others as much as they can. So this is a pragmatic thing of what can you feasibly do and still maintain your power, which is exactly what politicians and whatnot do. And therefore, they are risking losing their power, but they're also risking gaining it. And therefore, this is a very high-stakes game, as politics can definitely be. But these two options of crime, which makes us happy, or the scaffold, which stops us from being unhappy, that puts it quite extremely, but it is definitely the case that it's very similar to what Thrasymachus is trying to say. That, look, if you just listen to the pact, if you obey society, If you pay your taxes like a good boy, well, you'll lose money. But if you can manage to evade those taxes, if you can skillfully avoid these, committing the most perfect injustice, as Thrasymachus says, well, as long as you can get away with it, and you have the power, therefore, to instantiate some sense of authority and having a right to be there, well, then you win. You get to take advantage of other people, and you get to create the laws. And the rules too, because that's what justice is for Thrasymachus. It is a sort of a contract created by those in power. It is a social convention. It is not something that is ontologically independent of the authority which utters the word. And Socrates has this kind of sleazy thing that he does where he basically is constantly doing a no true Scotsman fallacy. He's talking about, well, it is likely that if a city of good men came to be, there would be a fight over not ruling, just as there is now over ruling. And there it would become manifest that a true ruler really does not naturally consider his own advantage, but rather that of the one who is ruled. So it's like, oh, the one who is really the ruler, and how are we determining this? Well, basically just Socrates' utterance of, oh, this is what is most perfect. This replicates the form somehow. That the true ruler is the one who never cares for his advantage. But this just seems to be neglecting the reality of things. And Socrates tries to say that, in fact, it is not antithetical to being a good ruler to, for example, have some sort of monetary reimbursement. That you can still be a ruler and be genuinely concerned solely for your citizens, even if you happen also to benefit it, which seems like this is violating its own principle, because there is some self-concern in here. It's not just pure justice. There's no pure justice, of course. Everyone is always a little bit just, a little bit unjust. Maybe they're having some genuine empathy, but they're also having some genuine narcissism for themselves. And he says, for example, do you call the medical art the wage earner's art, even if a man practicing medicine should earn a wage? And it seems to be no. Thrasymachus says this is certainly not the case, that the medical art is the medical art. And even when he's earning a wage, that's just an add-on. It doesn't genuinely change the medical art. But no. This would be just to deal with medicine in an abstract way. You can say that true medicine in and of itself is purely and solely concerned with the health of bodies. Now, this is great, but can you actually do this? No, you can't. If, for example, you want to be a medical practitioner, let's talk about this in the contemporary sense, because if what Plato and Socrates are saying is true, it is universal. It should be able to apply to modern medicine as well, with at least enough validity to still hold. When you're a medical practitioner, sure, you care for your patients. But what else do? You earn a profit. You proliferate your business. You focus on marketing, and you focus on maintaining, for example, your dominance in an area, because you'll have competitors who will make your business go down naturally. As things get more saturated, you will get less business and therefore less profit, less money. Now, is this bad? No, we would just say that this is part of what it means to be a medical practitioner. And this isn't just an add-on. No, this is what it is to practice medicine. Medicine can be for health and profit genuinely at the same time. These aren't mutually exclusive. And Plato wants to imply that no, the medical practitioner is solely concerned with medicine, and even if he earns wages, that is not at all infringing upon that pure form of medicine. No, it is fundamentally changing what it means to be a medical practitioner. You cannot be solely concerned with your patients. You're also concerned with, for example, your health and your mood and your schedule and all this other stuff. You can't just live in this ideal high-in-the-sky place. So when we're talking about the true ruler, or the one who really is a ruler. You can put all these qualifiers on it, but as far as I'm concerned, this is just a no true Scotsman to try to put Socrates' position in an unfalsifiable position, because we can't actually talk about that ideal realm. And like I mentioned before, Socrates does try to give us a bit of a pragmatic argument, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a bit of a rarity for Socrates, where he says, gratify me this much more and tell me, do you believe that either a city or an army or pirates or robbers or any other tribe which has some common unjust enterprise would be able to accomplish anything if its members acted unjustly to one another? Surely not, he said, that being Thrasymachus. And what if they didn't act unjustly? Wouldn't they be more able to accomplish something? Certainly, he said. For surely, Thrasymachus, it's injustice that produces factions, hatreds, and quarrels amongst themselves, and justice that produces unanimity and friendship. Isn't it so? And this is an important argument, right? If we want to, for example, talk about the social contract theory, I think Hobbes is very much inspired by the Republic and this sort of reasoning. Well, if we want to make stable contracts, we have to have this agreed upon, okay, we're going to kind of pull back the state of nature a bit, and we're going to engage in this mutual project where I say I'm not going to kill you, you say you're not going to kill me, and it provides us some sort of firm foundation, some unanimity in our project, some friendship, some commonality in our project by which we can, actually last and create contracts with one another. But this is really just a pragmatic argument for getting along. This isn't to say that the authentic ruler needs to be the one who is just. It just means that you need to balance those unjust practices which provide for one's advantage, and the just practices which not only provide that fundament upon which we can build stable societies, but also upon which you can have the semblance of authority that is not yet tyranny. You're a good ruler. You deserve to be where you are, right? And this is very much the case that if it's just pure war, if it's just pure injustice, yeah, you get a bunch of warring factions who hate each other. But as long as you can find the dividing line where you can have a system that is suitably fraught with people vying for their personal interests, but also enough commonality through justice to allow for some longevity, then you've got longevity, right? And I think one of the telling things that Socrates fails to realize when he talks about justice, he says that it produces unanimity and friendship, but it also produces complacency and ignorance, right? If you think that your rulers are solely there for your gain and that they represent me, I don't have to worry about them, well, you just open a power vacuum up for the unjust to succeed. So you can see that there's a dialectic here between the one who is conscious of social justice and the just or unjust ruler, which I think is an important facet that we need to keep in mind. So that being said, I think that'll be it for covering book 1 of Plato's Republic. I'll probably be doing most, if not all, of these in the coming weeks and months. I'm taking up classical political philosophy class, and this is one of the books that we're covering, so just using this to kind of help get these ideas out there, see what other people are thinking, because sometimes it sucks to read some of these classical thinkers which are just kind of conceited in certain ways, and they have such a high reputation, but sometimes they don't give the best arguments, in my opinion. But that being said, that's it for this lecture. Check out any of my others I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and as a poor college student, it'd be much appreciated. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.